Cyrix. Whatever happened to them? Back in the 90s they were one of the leading developers of x86 compatible processors. But you mention the brand now and people might think you're talking about the best enhanced shaman on the face of the universe. If you can even stand on the face of the universe? Wouldn't that be God's face? I don't know. Or they might just think you've mispronounced Cyrix. But a microprocessor developer is unlikely to spring to mind. So let's begin at the beginning and follow this primarily 90s tale of semiconductor fabrication. It's a sunny day in Richardson, Texas. The year is 1987, and Tom Brightman and Jerry Rogers are in a good mood, mainly because they've just set the seeds in motion for Cyrix Corporation. The world of solid-state components is accelerating rapidly, and the duo believe they've identified an area where they can thrive. Neither is a stranger to this world, having both worked at Texas Instruments before following brimming career paths. Jerry's stint at TI involved work as a VLSI design engineer and manager, filing 12 patents for microprocessor and controller work. He became vice president and manager of the microprocessor division in 1981, before moving to become CEO of Visual Information Technologies. It was from here that he met Seven Rosen, a venture capital firm that would assist in the launch of Cyrix with $4 million of startup capital. Tom also worked in the field of VLSI since 1975, designing numerous network, microprocessor and DSP-based system products and integrated circuits. After Texas Instruments, he was key in manufacture at both Commodore and Atari before reuniting with Jerry in 1987 to start on their new venture. The niche the duo had discovered was in the world of Intel-compatible maths coprocessors. The market was ripe and there was little competition other than Intel's own components, but rather than X-raying Intel's chips and copying the layout, instead Cyrix based their chips around completely new logic, referring to the documented and seeking the undocumented functions of Intel's products. Using these methods and armed with only a 30-man design team, Cyrix were able to create two clones with a very high degree of compatibility. These were the Cyrix FastMath 83D87 and 83S87 for the DX and SX386 chips respectively. Unlike the Intel 387DX, the Cyrix chips do not support asynchronous operation of both the CPU and coprocessor, but had advanced power-saving features which automatically shut down unused parts of the chip. The increased reliance on hardwired logic over microcode also allowed the Cyrix designs to operate at a greater speed than Intel's implementations on floating-point operations. Cyrix, being a fabless operation, outsourced manufacture of these initial chips to their friends at Texas Instruments, and by 1989 had launched their DX chip, with the SX variant following in 1990. Both chips slightly undercut Intel equivalents in price, making them a very tantalizing prospect for users looking to upgrade their machines with floating point acceleration, and initially this was the main selling point. In the field, floating point benchmarks of the 83D87 showed performance almost twice as fast as Intel's equivalent, although in other tests this was much less pronounced. But it was enough to secure Cyrix's place in the market and their expansion onto bigger and better things. This started with the EMC87 coprocessor in June 1990, which offered even greater speeds than their previous units, followed in 1991 by the FastMath CX5X86. Such a catchy name. Based around their 83D87, this was a 287 interchangeable coprocessor, although a much faster one, quickly finding its place as the fastest coprocessor available for 286 based machines. Now, Cyrix weren't mainstream by this stage, but were quickly acquiring a name for doing things faster and cheaper. So in 1992, when Cyrix announced upgrades for actual 386 processors, it was no real surprise. By now, Intel's 486 processor was becoming well embedded in desktop computers, having launched back in 1989. However, many users were still using 386 machines and wanted a cheaper upgrade route. It's with this in mind that Cyrix released the 486 SLC and 486 DLC chips in May and June 1992 respectively. The SLC was a pin-compatible replacement for 386SX processors, which only had a 16-bit data path, with the DLC a replacement for DX equivalents, offering a full 32-bit data path. Available in 25, 33 and 40 MHz flavours, benchmarks were quite favourable, especially when cost was considered, with the 40 MHz DLC able to outperform a true 25 MHz 486SX machine. Essentially, these chips contained a 486 instruction set coupled with a 1KB level 1 cache, 7KB less than an Intel 486, and quickly acquired the moniker of a half 486. But they weren't the only processors of this kind. 386 upgrade competition was also provided by Intel's own Rapid CAD processor and the Super 386 offered by Chips and Technologies. However, both of these lacked even the 1KB of L1 cache and proved less successful than the Cyrix offering. These 486 wannabes gained some traction among budget-minded enthusiasts, however they failed to enter the OEM market on any significant scale. Although the SLC chip did gain some favour with laptop manufacturers due to its low power consumption and ease of installation. It effectively allowed suppliers to boast laptops with a 486 named chip at a fraction of the competition's cost. Cyrix went on to release the 486 SRX2 and DRX2, essentially clock-doubled versions of these earlier upgrades. They also eliminated some issues their previous chips had with cache control lines on early 386 motherboards. It would be in May 1993 where Cyrix would start to enter the mainstream alongside AMD and Intel, with an Intel 486SX pin-compatible CPU, the CX486S processor. This was followed by the DX and DX2 versions in the same year, which offered clock doubling, the same as Intel's DX2, but at a significantly cheaper price. If only enthusiasts had heard of Cyrix up until now, this would be the point that the average PC buyer might start to take notice and factor this lower cost alternative into their decision-making process. Breaking rank from previous designs, the new processors did benchmark slightly lower than AMD and Intel counterparts, but their ability to run at 5 volts compared to the 3.3 volts of AMD chips meant they could be used as upgrades in early 5V 486 motherboards. This time round, various OEMs took notice and proudly advertised their new wallet-friendly 486 machines, although large brands like Acer and Compaq were wooed only by the AMD alternative, leaving Cyrix still a bit of an underdog in this silicon race. The problem was, 1993 was also the year Intel's P5 architecture landed, with the original Pentium processors. Cyrix, and indeed other manufacturers such as AMD, had some catching up to do. This is also around the time of a number of lawsuits, one of many the company seemingly found itself either instigating or caught up in, spending more each year on lawsuits than its original $4 million startup capital. At the time, Intel seemed to have a gripe with every rival x86 manufacturer and gave no exceptions to Cyrix. However, with Cyrix's from-the-ground-up approach, Intel were set to invariably lose. An out-of-court settlement then gave Cyrix the right to produce its own x86 designs in any foundry which held an Intel license. Texas Instruments held a license, but during 1994, Cyrix would fall out with them over production difficulties. Instead, an alliance with an alternative license holder, IBM Microelectronics, was established. Being unable to produce the chips themselves, having a reliable fabricator was essential for Cyrix, and therefore the possibly less than favourable deal struck meant that IBM earned the right to build and sell half of the Cyrix design processors under their IBM name. This might sound quite dreary, but 1994 would still prove to be a record year for the growth of Cyrix. It was around this time that a tombstone was erected in the Cyrix main office stating RIP Intel inside, something Jerry was very proud of. By 1995, Cyrix's Pentium clone was still not ready, but instead they had an old trick up their sleeve. This trick would be presented in the form of the Cyrix CX5X86 processor. Just like their early 386 upgrades, this chip plugged directly into a 3.3V 486 socket and ran at 80, 100 or 120 MHz speeds. Running at 100 MHz yielded performance comparable to a Pentium 75, and this was by far the most common iteration of the chip. And so, just like that, us 486 owners seemingly had an upgrade route to Pentium bliss, but without having to do much more than shell out a few quid. Of course, it wasn't quite that simple. You had to have a compatible BIOS to begin with, and then of course there was the capabilities. This time around, Intel had beaten Cyrix to it, and had launched the 486 pin-compatible Pentium Overdrive in February 1995, some 6 months before the 5X86. But priced at some $449 or about £400 in the UK, this was definitely not a cheap upgrade route, and what's more, chips like the 5X86 outperformed it in most benchmarks. Although the Overdrive was far more compatible with the Pentium instruction set, the 5X86 was more like a very souped up 486 processor. And although the 5X86 was affordable, one area of contention was the lack of branch prediction, a key element of the Pentium line. And I say contention here because the 5X86 did have branch prediction, and indeed the benchmarks Cyrix pushed were with the branch prediction features turned on. But due to instabilities it was disabled before release. Very cheeky! You could in fact re-enable this through specialist software, but it resulted in an unstable system, so it was fairly useless. For people like myself who spent weeks poring over benchmarks seeking an upgrade route, this was quite a disappointment. Of course, the processor was much faster than my 486, but it just failed to present the same optimizations in newer games, or even run them at all, given most software was being designed with a true Pentium architecture in mind. But still, having a 586 processor installed in my system always gave me a warm feeling every time I booted it up. For some reason I've always enjoyed seeing systems pushed to their absolute limits, and so for me this was therefore the perfect processor, whether I'd intended it to be or not. Searching through the cover disks for Pentium only software that worked on my 5X86 was my kind of mustard. But when it did happen, I had the smug satisfaction that my CPU was truly ahead of AMD's AM5X86, which was merely a clock quadrupled 486 trying to shuffle in on the act. Although to be fair, I don't think I ever did find any Pentium only software that would run on it. But that would all change.
Does this war agree with you?
Yeah, like a pair of busted wing flaps.
The 5X86 only had a production run of a measly 6 months, as Cyrix diverted all their energy and production to focus on their new 6X86 processor, codenamed the M1. IBM would be left manufacturing their own 5X86 iterations until 1998, but of course would also gain rights for the 6X86 under their production agreement. This 6th generation processor, in the eyes of Cyrix at least, was one of the first true Pentium rivals on the market, launching on October 6, 1995, and beating AMD's K5 by several months. This was their first P5 socket compatible processor, and early reviews were very good. You can see in this PC Magazine Winstone benchmark from March 96 that the Cyrix 6X86-100 is beating both Pentium 120 and Pentium 133 systems, and for a cheaper price. There was little not to like, and this would see Cyrix quickly escalate from budget upgrade path provider to technological leader of the pack. The initial 3.5V 100MHz units did need substantial cooling, by 90s standards at least, as can be seen here, but this was rectified with subsequent 2.8V models. Of course, Cyrix knew they'd cracked something big here, and in January 96, alongside their competitors AMD, SGS Thompson, and also IBM, they had defined the P rating system that would start appearing after March on the official names of their processor. The 6X86-100 would become the 6X86-P120 Plus, the 110 would become the P133 Plus, and so on, based on Winstone 96 results conducted by Microstone Resources. The change was primarily implemented so that consumers weren't put off by the lower megahertz numbers of the Cyrix processors, but it also made more sense from a comparison perspective. Some people were baffled and even enraged by the system, but pushed by Cyrix and their partners, it quickly became the accepted norm. Of course, if you look at the super pipelined architecture of the 6x86, it's easy to see why it outperformed the P5. It's actually more similar to a Pentium Pro than a bog standard Pentium, with features such as register renaming, multi-branch prediction and speculative execution. And being optimised for 16 and 32-bit Windows applications, its performance was bound to excel in the consumer market. This really peaked in June, with the 6x86 P200 becoming the fastest x86 based CPU in the world, and the first non-Intel chip to achieve that status in 18 years. For those interested in performance, it was an essential upgrade. Intel may have had superior fabrication abilities with the Pentium manufactured to a 0.35 micron process compared to IBM's 0.5, but they were falling behind the efficiencies and optimizations designed into the underdog's chip. By this point, Intel were understandably irked, and with little direction to move, threatened action against the P rating system, as people were mistakenly referring to it as a Pentium rating rather than performance rating. Cyrix quickly resolved this by simply changing the name to PR. Intel then went on a rampage about other companies freeloading off their advertising and demanded all badges be removed from PC cases apart from the Intel badge. They might have blown a fuse if it hadn't been for a saviour in the form of Quake. The 6x86 was designed with business software in mind as a baseline. Of course, it was great at running games as well, but this was primarily a 2D game world. Quake launching in June would, however, change that. Whilst developing Quake, John Carmack realised that FPU and integer operations used different parts of the Pentium core and could be effectively overlapped. This nearly doubled the speed of FPU-intensive game code. However, on Cyrix processors, the operations didn't overlap. This effectively halved the execution speed. This is why when I upgraded from my 5x86 to a 6x86, pretty much exclusively to play games like Quake, I was yet again faced with a degree of disappointment. Quake was, evidently, extremely popular, and as more and more people used it in their performance tests, the lofty position held by the Cyrix processors began to slip further and further. The public, of course, tended to simplify the problem and jumped on the 6x86 for having poor floating point performance. This is a claim Cyrix tried to rebuke through a series of benchmarks on their website, somewhat at odds with magazine tests. Although you may notice that their 3D descent test made use of an accelerator card, and obviously there's no Quake test to be found here. But what I do find amusing is this little paragraph. The 6x86 processor performs equal to the comparable Pentium in some cases, while the Pentium performs better in others. However, in all cases, both the 6x86 and Pentium processors achieve the smooth motion frame rate of greater than 13 frames per second. 13 frames per second! Can you imagine gamers today getting 13 frames a second and being happy with it? I hear people complain that games are barely playable when frame rates drop onto 60 today. But anyway, with multimedia on the rise, Intel would launch the Pentium MMX in October 96 and begin to thwart the short-lived reign of Cyrix. The MMX extensions weren't particularly impressive, but it's almost as if Jerry Rogers wanted to quit whilst he was ahead, as on December 9, 1996 he stepped down from his role as President and CEO, remaining on the board of directors. Co-founder Tom Brightman would remain as Vice President. Jay Swent, the Senior Vice President of Finance and Administration, stepped up to chair in his place. And it's probably no accident he was the President of Finance and Administration, because despite their success, Cyrix had posted a net loss of $6.9 million in the year ending September 30th. Strangely, they had been making profits of $6 million a year earlier, and this was attributed to increasing competition and the need for substantial price cuts in the market. But Cyrix were far from over at this point. Their 6x86 was still a strong contender, and by the end of May 1997, their MMX rivaling product, the 6x86MX, was unveiled. Remaining socket compatible with its predecessor and claiming to deliver Pentium 2 performance at half the price, the new range of P6 processors Intel had only introduced a few weeks beforehand. Cyrix had also begun a two-prong attack by launching the new Media GX processor in February, aiming to create a whole new budget PC market, based around their existing 5x86 chips. These new processors offered an all-in-one PC solution and was in fact one of the first PCs on a chip. Well, there was also a CX5X86 companion chip to handle sound and some of the bus functions, but it was almost there. Integrating their Express RAM, Express Graphics and Express Audio all within the same processing structure. At just $99 for the 133MHz flavour, compared to say $407 for a 166MHz Pentium MMX without additional components, this really did open up a new landscape and is essentially the main harbinger for the true budget low-end PC market which Intel and AMD would need to catch up with. By now, Cyrix had no troubles getting OEMs on board. Compaq were one of the first, with their Presario 2100 storming in at under $1,000, which seemed to create all sorts of hype. Sure, it wasn't going to knock the socks off a P200 owner, but here was a kind of almost Pentium with 24MB of RAM, a 2.1GB hard drive, 8-speed CD-ROM drive and Sound Blaster compatible sound for a very reasonable price. I mean, you had to pay extra for the monitor, and savvy consumers could pick up a lesser known brand with a better spec for about the same price. But with the Compaq badge, it caught the media attention, and that's exactly what Cyrix needed. It wasn't long before other big name manufacturers started shipping Cyrix processors in their machines, seemingly moving their brand image up a notch. After 3 consecutive quarters of losses, Cyrix posted a profit for the first quarter of 1997, but their previous posted revenues of $183.8 million were still a tiny dent in the $15.4 billion worldwide processor market. Still seeking a CEO and looking favourable, Cyrix seemed ripe for a buyout, and National Semiconductor seemed to agree, acquiring Cyrix in November 1997 for a $550 million stock exchange, as an autonomous and wholly owned subsidiary. It was the Media GX which had really roused their interests, with Brian Haller, Semiconductor's CEO, stating, "We intend for the Cyrix acquisition to give us the building blocks to provide system-on-a-chip solutions for sub-$500 PCs, and a broad range of low-cost information appliances." Seemingly, advancing the 6x86MX design to keep pace with Intel and AMD was not on their agenda. However, Cyrix would later announce that its merger would not change their development or marketing plans. This focus on the Media GX did create sales, but with less focus on staying with the competition, it wasn't long before both Intel and AMD were outpacing Cyrix once again. The new Slot 1 Pentium 2 had launched in May 1997, leaving other manufacturers stuck in Socket 7 motherboards. Rival AMD followed up with their impressive K6 processor range in April. Rather interestingly, the Pentium 2 and Pro designs actually created a legal dispute whereby this time, Cyrix accused Intel of copying their power management and register renaming methods from their 6x86 for use in the Pentium 2 architecture. But this was settled quite quickly after the National Semiconductor buyout, with a cross-license agreement allowing both parties to borrow each other's patents. Although not stipulated, this suggests somewhat that Cyrix had a good case, but was undoubtedly eased by National Semiconductor already holding a license for Intel's chip designs. Unfortunately, the world began to look bleak for Cyrix. Before 1997 was out, they had to issue a 10,000 chip recall on their 6x86MX P200 line due to high failure rates. This may have been partly to blame for the delay on their Pentium 2 rival, the M2, released in early 1998. This chip may have held the number 2 in its name, but really it was just a rebadged 6x86MX available in some higher clocked iterations, but all of which were really pushing their manufacture process at the time. Both the floating point and integer capabilities were now drastically falling behind Intel's and AMD's new processors, and coupled with this, Intel had released budget Celeron versions of their Pentium 2 processors, in a bid to claim the sub-$1,000 PC market, the same market National Semiconductor were keen on seizing. By September 98, the AMD K62 with its superior performance accounted for 68% of sub-$1,000 PCs. A reported cache bug in systems with more than 32MB of RAM was really no issue at this lower end level, whilst Intel's Celeron was level pegging the M2 at 16% market share each. Technology versus cost was accelerating at such a rate that the Media GX, even having reached a 266MHz MX iteration, was already starting to look obsolete, especially with whisperings of a 500MHz AMD K7 on the horizon. National Semiconductor would end their production agreement with IBM at the end of this year, having brought most of their production in-house at their new manufacturing facility in Maine, and having already launched 300 and 333 iterations of its M2 on a 0.25 micron process. Their next step was to try and rival their competition with a 0.18 micron process the following year with the M2 433, which ran at 300MHz, and then release a range of new processors. Cyrix knew they were starting to fall behind, but had the good grace to acknowledge poor performance under certain games with their M2. They seemed keen to retain their budget market whilst also catching up with the pack leaders. Their senior vice president, Kevin McDonough, was quick to stave off fears by throwing a range of names about. In development were two cores, the Jalapeno and the KN. The KN was designed for three variations. The first, codenamed Jedi, was for Socket 7. It was labelled to be their next upgrade and looking to incorporate the 3D Now extensions along with better FPU performance. The second was Gobi, a Socket 370 compatible CPU that would push the technology further. And the third was the MXI, offering integrated graphics and designed to replace the Media GX. The Jalapeno core was their true next generation, pegged for release in the Mojave processor, after the end of the millennium, which I wanted to say just because it sounds pretty epic. The Jalapeno would have a dual-issue FPU, an 11-stage pipeline, and integrated 3D graphics that could store textures in its L2 cache, and by the sound of things really could have put Cyrix back on the map. In this late 1998 interview from PC Magazine, McDonough seems very upbeat of the company position, including putting their Media GX to use in all sorts of products, such as set-top boxes and fridges. He even seemingly states that they could be in a position to completely throw Intel off track, but thankfully weren't looking to put them out of business. What good guys. However, this, through circumstance, really became a case of all mouth and no trousers, mainly because the trousers didn't have any money in their pockets.
Through this door is the power to make the internet come to life.
By 1999, AMD and Intel were leapfrogging each other with clock speeds, and not only Cyrix but National Semiconductor were finding themselves in financial difficulty. Their intentions and plans seemed credible, but they seemed to have fallen too far behind. On June 30th, 1999, VIA Technologies would acquire the Cyrix chip design division for the net sum of $167 million, followed almost immediately by Centaur Technology from Integrated Device Technology for a cool $51 million, allowing VIA to enter the x86 processor market. VIA, like Cyrix started out, was a fabless company, and so manufacture would continue at National Semiconductor's plant in Maine before moving to Taiwan. There are some stories from Cyrix employees knocking around from this era, and it paints a rather interesting picture of events immediately prior to acquisition. After talking to the engineers at their Richardson base, it seems VIA's CEO, Chen-Wan Shi, was a little surprised to hear some projects were behind in their design schedules, somewhat at odds with McDonough's interview the year prior. So an agreement was made for National Semiconductor to lay off half of the Cyrix staff at their cost. VIA's interest was really in the Cyrix brand and their IP, which, as we know, had a separate genus to Intel's processors, and could therefore be used in defense against an Intel lawsuit aimed at VIA's current chipsets and any future processors. Cyrix's research and development costs were at that point $10 million per month. The Mojave concept was very far off, and so was immediately dropped with all other projects, apart from Gobi, which was almost at the sampling phase. This was the point when Tom Brightman would leave the company, and between a lot of good experienced staff being let go and others simply being snapped up by competitors, VIA was left with Cyrix's back catalogue, their brand, intellectual property and the Gobi project and staff. The Gobi codename was then renamed to Joshua, keeping in line with Chen Wenqi's biblical naming preference. Joshua then, poised to become the Cyrix M3 with its 7-stage KN core, was expected to top out at around 600 MHz, but was consuming some 25 watts. The Centaur technology team VIA had also snapped up had also been working on a sluggish WinChip core that was by now known as Samuel. This core had 12 stages, allowing for more effective overclocking, and only drew 6 watts at similar clock speeds. The decision was therefore taken by VIA to stop production of Joshua and go full speed ahead with Samuel. This is the processor that would ultimately be branded the VIA Cyrix 3 and launched in 2001. And this was seen by many as a poor move given the potentially superior abilities of the Joshua chip that was speculated to outperform the AMD K7, but on a much smaller die. The C3 may not have been the most powerful package available, but it did beat the competition in power consumption and met the demands of the embedded marketplace quite well, finding use in notebooks, with the latest C7 revision finding its way into the HP 2133 Mini Note PC family. The last processor to retain the C part of the Cyrix name, the VIA C7M, released in 2007 as a mobile processor. So this really leaves the M2 433 in April 1999 the last real Cyrix processor. But that's not the end of the story. Although VIA bought out most of Cyrix, National Semiconductor actually held on to the Media GX processor. It seems they really did want to hold on to the chip that had forged their initial deal back in 1997. National Semiconductor renamed the Media GX to the Geode at the end of 1999 and sold them mainly for use in thin clients and industrial control systems. These processors were developed further to the Geode GX2 in 2002 before being bought up by AMD and sold into 2009 under various guises and iterations. But the actual Media GX core variation was discontinued in 2006. So for those hoping to cling onto the Cyrix dream, there very might well be a few strands of Cyrix left in AMD processors here and there, but 2006 pretty much draws the end of the line for the work Cyrix began way back in 1987. The Cyrix story is one hell of a ride, but I suppose their biggest accomplishment was laying the foundations for the budget PC market without really sacrificing performance, and they did all of this without the funds the other companies held. Indeed, that alone is one of the reasons I have so much passion for the Cyrix brand. Between 1995 and 1998, Cyrix processors allowed me to upgrade my PC to levels I simply wouldn't have enjoyed without their presence in the market. And sure, sometimes their CPUs didn't quite live up to expectations, but for me that just made it all the more fun, because everyone loves an underdog, right? In a big way, these processor rivalries of the 90s felt very much like the Spectrum vs Commodore, Amiga vs Atari ST, and Sega vs Nintendo battles of years gone by. It didn't really matter if your hardware was technically inferior or not. It didn't matter because it was yours. It brought you joy, and for that reason it was worth defending until the very end. Things haven't really changed today, have they? I'll tell you what, as you've stayed till the end, here's a bit of Cyrix trivia for you. The Arnold Schwarzenegger film Eraser featured a defense corporation known as Cyrix. Cyrix got a bit upset about the potential name confusion, so asked for it to be changed. Costing some $1 million, and over the course of a week, the name was then retroactively edited to become Cyrez, both digitally and vocally, with some actors having to re-record their lines. You can see some remnants of this in this scene, with the computer code clearly an abbreviation of Cyrix rather than Cyrez. How nice. Thanks for watching this video about Cyrix. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want more stories, you can click one there. You can subscribe. If you want to help support my channel, you can do so through Patreon. In any case, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a great evening.